The click of Erin's pen was louder than her voice, precise, metallic, final. She slid the restructure form across the table, smiling like she'd just signed progress itself. My name, my title, my decade of quiet accuracy, erased with one motion. The fluorescent light above us flickered once, just enough to catch the reflection of her confidence. I didn't protest. I only adjusted the edge of the document, perfectly aligned, and whispered, "Be sure you understand every clause before you approve it." Before I go on, where are you watching from? Hit like and subscribe. This one gets personal. The boardroom smelled faintly of burnt coffee and perfume strong enough to hide discomfort. Erin Voss leaned against the edge of the conference table, her voice smooth as glass. "Rachel, the executive committee has decided to restructure the compliance division. We need more agility, less bureaucracy." The words sliced through the air like a paper cut you don't feel until it bleeds. My title, Senior Compliance Auditor, glowed from the slide behind her, highlighted in red as position merged. Around the table, managers shifted, pretending to check their tablets. HR's representative avoided eye contact, hands folded like a mourner at a funeral. Erin smiled the way people do when they've already moved on from the scene of their own cruelty. "You've been invaluable," she added, "but the future is automation." I felt my pulse in my throat, but not a single muscle twitched. 10 years of precision reduced to a soundbite about efficiency. I had audited our clinical trials through recalls, lawsuits, and budget cuts. She had been here 5 months. The projector hummed softly, flashing the word "eliminated" beside my name. Erin capped her pen with a click that felt like a verdict. "We'll need your signature on the restructuring form today." The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. I reached for the pen, steady, careful. "Of course," I said, meeting her eyes. "I always sign what I understand completely." Her smile faltered for just a second, long enough for me to see the first crack forming. The sound of that pen still echoed in my ears hours later, sharper than any insult could have been. I sat in the HR office, a sterile box lined with fake ferns and motivational posters about resilience. The coordinator, a young man who couldn't have been older than my internship at this company, slid the paperwork toward me like it might bite him. "We just need your acknowledgement, Ms. Sloan. Standard process." I read each line as if I were reviewing a contract for a hostile acquisition. Position merged. Duties reassigned. No further obligation. Each phrase was a neat incision, separating me from everything I had built. Erin's fingerprints were on every sentence, her language of efficiency wrapped around bureaucratic knives. My hands didn't shake as I initialed each page. They wanted emotion, apology, protest, something to reaffirm their control. Instead, I gave them precision. "Can I get a copy of the updated policies?" I asked, voice flat, professional. The coordinator blinked. "Policies?" "Every revised compliance directive approved this quarter," I said. "I'll need them for my records." He nodded quickly, fumbling for a printer cue. While he waited, I studied the office clock, watching the second hand sweep through the minute like a scalpel. Silence, to me, had always been a diagnostic tool. It told you where the infection began. When he returned with the stack, I thanked him, slid the documents into my bag, and stood. "You've been very efficient," I said, echoing Erin's favorite compliment. His smile twitched nervously. In the hallway, I passed the framed photograph of our founding team. 10 faces, 9 signatures at the bottom of the compliance charter. Mine was the 10th. The plaque beneath it read, "Accountability is our foundation." Funny how words become decorations when people stop believing them. I walked out through the revolving door, each rotation catching a reflection of my face. Steady, unreadable. Outside, the cold Boston air burned clean in my lungs. No rage, no tears, just the peculiar stillness that comes when the temperature of your conviction finally matches the frost around you. Erin thought she'd silenced me by removing my title. What she didn't understand was that silence was where I did my best work. I wasn't always the woman who measured her words by their temperature. 10 years earlier, I'd been the one still awake at 2:09 a.m., poring over audit trails and supplier invoices under a desk lamp that flickered like a pulse. The company had nearly lost its FDA certification back then, a contamination scare that could have buried us. I was a junior auditor then, nameless and invisible. While executives panicked in conference calls, I sat in a freezing server room, tracing the chain of custody backward through 16 vendors until I found the missing batch ID handwritten on a misfiled document. That correction, 2 digits, saved the company from a national recall. No one remembered my name in the press release. They remembered the slogan we created afterward, "Safety starts with precision." I carried that line like a private joke. Precision wasn't a slogan to me, it was oxygen. I didn't work for praise or performance bonuses or company picnics. I worked because accuracy was the only language I trusted in a world addicted to shortcuts. Even after promotions came, I never traded that language for jargon. Others mastered optics. I mastered truth. My desk was plain, my reports meticulous. When a director once called me our quiet anchor, I smiled. Anchors aren't glamorous. They're the things you only notice when they fail. Erin Voss noticed me too, but not in admiration. To her, I was a fossil, someone who slowed progress with inconvenient questions. When she arrived with her lean ethics initiative, I didn't argue. I simply audited the audit. The first draft of her framework contained 19 procedural conflicts, 2 of which would have voided our manufacturing approval. I documented them neatly, color-coded, and submitted them with the header, "Non-conformity Analysis." She never acknowledged it. A week later, the file disappeared from the shared drive. She replaced it with a new version titled Ethics Simplified. Simplified. Her word for stripped bare. It was then I realized she wasn't building compliance. She was building theater. Bright dashboards, glossy terminology, predictive algorithms that promised oversight without oversight. The board applauded her innovation. I watched, silent, as she replaced substance with symmetry. My respect for rules was never about control. It was about protection. Every clause, every verification step existed to keep someone safe from contamination, from loss, from greed. Erin thought compliance was a cage. I knew it was scaffolding, and when she began dismantling it piece by piece, smiling as the bolts fell, I understood my role wasn't to stop her anymore. It was to let her build her tower high enough for the wind to touch it. Then, when the time came, I'd let gravity finish the work I'd started years ago, with a single clause buried deep where no algorithm could reach. The announcement came 2 weeks after my demotion, wrapped in the kind of glossy optimism only corporate emails can manage. Introducing the Lean Ethics platform, it read, accompanied by a photo of Erin Voss, smiling beside a touchscreen display that looked like a game show prop. The system, according to her memo, would streamline compliance through automated contract validation and machine learning integrity scans. Translation: remove the human element, the one thing that actually caught the lies. She launched it in the main conference hall with the board in attendance. Lights dimmed, cameras recording for the internal newsletter. I stood at the back, technically invited as legacy oversight, which was another way of saying witness to my own extinction. Erin strutted across the stage in a crimson blazer, sharp enough to cut glass, waving her hands like a conductor before an obedient orchestra. "We're entering a new era," she declared. "Ethics shouldn't slow innovation. It should power it. Applause followed, thick and dutiful. On the display behind her, animated graphs soared upward, while a line of text scrolled beneath. 0 manual reviews required. That was the moment I knew she'd gone too far. The supplier approval workflow she'd automated wasn't just an efficiency shortcut. It bypassed a federally mandated verification chain. Every supplier contract, every ingredient used in production had to be manually approved by a certified auditor. That certification was tied to a living person's credentials. Mine. Erin's new platform had no such signatory listed because she'd removed the redundant role. She'd effectively built a machine that could authorize shipments no one legally had the right to approve. I could have spoken up, interrupted her presentation, pointed to the very clause that would invalidate the system. Instead, I watched. The applause filled the room like static, echoing against the sterile walls. One of the junior managers leaned toward me, whispering, "Pretty impressive, right?" I smiled. "It's efficient," I said, "but efficiency is just speed without brakes." He nodded without understanding. Erin finished her speech with a flourish, promising real-time transparency and auditless compliance. The board members beamed, charmed by the buzzwords. She had sold them a mirror, and they loved their reflection. Afterward, in the corridor, she intercepted me. "Rachel," she said, all confidence and condescension. "How did you like the demo?" I answered honestly. "It was bold." She laughed. "I know you're skeptical, but we can't keep living in the past. These old protocols, you helped build them, but the industry's moved on." "Protocols don't age," I said. "Only people who stop respecting them." Her smile froze for a fraction of a second. "We'll see," she said, heels clicking away down the hallway, like punctuation marks to her own hubris. I returned to my office, emptied of most personal items except a single, framed certificate, FDA Compliance Signatory Authorization, valid through next quarter. My name, embossed and unrevoked. Erin had digitized everything except that. Paperwork, the kind she despised, was still the backbone of the law. She didn't even realize her entire platform hinged on my signature, my credentials embedded in a clause she never bothered to read. I sat back in my chair, the glow of her press release reflecting off the window. She'd built her empire on omission. All I had to do was let it run exactly as designed. The weeks after the platform launch felt like walking through a building that still stood, but no longer recognized its own foundations. Meetings I'd once led now appeared on calendars I couldn't access. Policy memos circulated without my initials. Erin's voice dominated every corridor, smooth, confident, almost hypnotic. "We're moving beyond manual oversight," she told the staff. "We're replacing red tape with transparency." It sounded noble if you didn't know what transparency meant in her language, blindness disguised as light. The first time she publicly undermined me was subtle. During a project review, a procurement director mentioned a discrepancy in supplier documentation. Erin turned to me and smiled. "Rachel, could you remind us why our legacy process needed 3 signatures? It feels excessive." Laughter rippled around the table, polite but sharp. I answered evenly. "Because one of those signatures is legally binding with the FDA." Her reply came like silk, hiding a blade. "Ah, but that's why we built the automation. No human bottlenecks." The implication was clear. I was the bottleneck. After that meeting, invitations stopped arriving. My input, when offered, was met with vague nods or that infuriating phrase, "We've already covered this." Colleagues who used to consult me quietly now avoided eye contact, fearful of association. Erin cultivated the narrative like a gardener pruning dissent. She praised me in public. "Rachel's been here since the beginning. She's a treasure." Then in private emails, she copied HR on every exchange, framing me as resistant, traditional, hesitant to embrace innovation. I saw the pattern because I'd audited manipulations before. They always start as documentation. One afternoon, my access to the compliance dashboard vanished. IT claimed it was a system migration. Temporary, they said. It never returned. Erin's assistant, a cheerful graduate with an MBA and zero understanding of regulation, began introducing herself as acting liaison for compliance modernization. The absurdity of it all would have been funny if it weren't so effective. Erin was rewriting the internal story. I wasn't being removed. I was transitioning out naturally. People prefer narratives that absolve them of complicity. Meanwhile, I watched from the sidelines, collecting every changelog, every memo revision, every deleted policy. I didn't correct anyone who whispered that I'd become irrelevant. Let them believe that. Relevance is noise. Influence, I'd learned, is quieter. One night, as I gathered my personal files from the network, I noticed the new ethics repository Erin had created. It contained exactly 2 folders: simplified procedures and decommissioned legacy. Inside the second, I found my old compliance templates neatly archived under the tag, obsolete. The irony made me laugh out loud. She'd preserved my work just to bury it. I closed the folder gently, almost affectionately. Let her believe the burial was complete. What she didn't realize was that I'd already written my name into the architecture of her future failure. She was editing symptoms, not structure, and structure, unlike perception, doesn't respond to PR. It responds to cause and effect. The morning after my access was revoked, I arrived early, earlier than anyone else, just to hear the building breathe before the workday began. Elevators hummed, vents sighed. The low-frequency rhythm of a place that believed itself stable. I watched the sunrise bleed through the frosted glass of the compliance floor and realized how easily absence could camouflage itself. My desk was still there, stripped bare, but still aligned to the grid. No one had touched the framed certificate pinned beside the monitor. My last FDA signatory authorization. That small embossed stamp was still legally active, though Erin hadn't bothered to verify. I took my coffee and walked the floor one last time, noting the chatter of early arrivals who spoke in half-whispers, still too polite to speak openly about my departure. "She'll retire soon," one voice said. "Probably for the best." I smiled faintly at that. People prefer their conscience tidy. On my monitor, the new ethics dashboard flashed a bright interface. Charts, colors, movement, all the illusions of life. It displayed no real data, only predictive placeholders. A simulation of order. Erin's shadow passed behind me, her heels crisp on the tile. She didn't stop. She didn't need to. Her silence was acknowledgement enough. I logged out for the final time, clearing my traces, then walked to the archive room where 10 years of paper records rested in labeled boxes. I ran my fingers along the spines of binders that held the company's true memory. Every inspection, every corrective action, every approval letter, each one required a living certification, a real name. Those names were vanishing, replaced by algorithmic signatures that couldn't hold up in a courtroom. I didn't feel anger anymore, only clarity. Erin was building an edifice of glass and calling it steel. I took what I needed: copies of the most recent revision logs, a few internal memos marked confidential, and my own archived statement on the compliance charter renewal, the one that contained the addendum I'd written years ago. Clause 9.g, unassuming in font, invisible to the casual eye but absolute in authority. I locked the cabinet, placed the key in the outbox tray, and left without ceremony. Outside, the February wind cut across my coat like a reprimand. I pulled the collar up, not to hide, but to shield the small, calm satisfaction spreading through me. Erin had inherited the frame of my work, but she'd hollowed out its substance. She thought she'd erased me. She didn't know she was already standing inside my blueprint. Clause 904B wasn't born out of paranoia. It was born from exhaustion. Years ago, after the contamination scare that nearly ruined us, I had watched executives scramble to assign blame while quietly approving new suppliers without reading the regulations that governed them. I drafted that clause on a Sunday morning, sitting in my apartment with a mug of black coffee and a legal pad already crowded with cross-references. It stated that any transfer or removal of a certified compliance signatory required a full revalidation with the FDA before operations could continue. It was meant as a safeguard, a way to prevent reckless substitutions. Erin never noticed it, because it wasn't written in technical language. It was written in plain English, the kind that slips past people who mistake simplicity for insignificance. The board ratified it years ago as part of the Ethics Renewal Act, buried deep within a policy packet no one ever reread. My signature sat. Beside it, the last living authorization attached to the clause. When Erin's platform launched and she erased my role, that clause became more than a rule. It became a countdown. Without a certified signatory, the company's license existed in limbo. No shipments, no trials, no approvals, just a system spinning its wheels without traction. I hadn't planned revenge back then. I had planned integrity. But integrity, when neglected long enough, has a habit of transforming into consequence. A week after my departure, I checked the public compliance registry through an old government portal still tied to my credentials. There it was, plain as daylight. The company's certification marked pending revalidation. I felt no thrill, no vindication, just inevitability. Systems obey physics and ethics alike. Remove one stabilizing element, and the structure begins to list. Erin's new automation might hide the cracks, but the foundation had already shifted. I poured another cup of coffee and read through the portal logs, noting each supplier whose access would soon be denied. The system would give them 48 hours to renew before suspension. I had nothing more to do. The process was mechanical now, impartial. Cause and effect. Still, part of me wondered how long it would take before someone noticed. Maybe days, maybe minutes. But I knew Erin. She didn't read fine print. She curated optics. Her eyes would be fixed on headlines, not legal footnotes, in a way that was her greatest vulnerability. She believed control meant visibility. I had learned the opposite. Real control lives in the unseen spaces, policies, permissions, and paragraphs nobody wants to read until they're burning. That night, I archived every document I'd written since 2014, stored them on a private encrypted drive, and labeled the folder Integrity. Not as a weapon, but as proof that structure still mattered. I shut the laptop and looked around my apartment, small but orderly. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and cinnamon from the candle I'd lit earlier. The peace felt unfamiliar. I realized that after years of carrying the weight of prevention, I no longer had to hold it up. Erin had taken that burden, unaware it came with pressure she couldn't survive. The beauty of Clause 904B wasn't its complexity, it was its precision. Remove one's certified name, and everything else waited for permission that would never come. The company had been running on my signature for years. Now it was running on silence. I approached my final handover like an autopsy, methodical, emotionless, exact. The request from HR had arrived with the polite urgency of bureaucratic theater. Please prepare comprehensive documentation of your ongoing projects for continuity. I smiled when I read it. Continuity was exactly what they wouldn't have. Over the next 3 days, I built a binder so immaculate it could have been a textbook. Every index tab was color-coded. Every section cross-referenced. I left no visible gaps, no careless omissions. The brilliance of concealment isn't what you remove. It's what you leave that looks complete. I included full vendor lists, procedural outlines, and compliance flowcharts, all clean, all accurate. Except one, the authorization chain that bridged internal approvals to the FDA validation portal stopped 2 lines short. The missing link wasn't hidden, it simply appeared finished. The file ended with a note printed in plain font, smaller than the rest. Pending ethics verification. Anyone reading it would assume it was under review. Nobody would think to question who the verifier was supposed to be. I made sure the formatting matched Erin's style, minimalist, self-assured, sterile. She'd never noticed the absence inside the symmetry. When the binder was complete, I placed it on my desk under a neat white label. Final Compliance Archive. Transition Copy. I wrote that phrase deliberately. Final and transition in the same breath are like opposite charges. They hum when placed together. Late that night, I logged into the shared server and mirrored all critical files to an encrypted drive. Not to sabotage, but to preserve the truth before their edits rewrote it beyond recognition. Each file name carried quiet defiance. 2017 Renewal Evidence, 2018 Audit Defense, 2019 Vendor Integrity. They were receipts of the invisible scaffolding that had held the company upright long after its leaders abandoned ethics for efficiency. I finished near midnight, the city outside soaked in sleet, reflections warping through the office windows. The place felt already hollow, an organism unaware of its own organ failure. On my way out, I passed the glass wall of Erin's office. Inside, her red blazer hung over her chair like an unfurled flag. Her screensaver looped a corporate motto she'd coined herself, integrity through innovation. I paused long enough to appreciate the irony. She believed innovation could replace integrity the way neon replaces daylight, brighter, cheaper, shorter-lived. I placed a yellow, sticky note on the inside cover of the binder before leaving. It said, in my handwriting, "Every structure needs a keystone." It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. By the time Erin picked up that binder, the countdown would already be underway. The system would hum obediently for a few more weeks, granting approvals under her new regime, until it reached the part of the process that required a certified signature. Then, everything would stop. No error messages, no alarms, just absence, the purest kind of truth. 3 weeks after my departure, Erin Voss was everywhere. Her face appeared in the company newsletter under the headline, Revolutionizing Ethics Through Technology. The article quoted her describing the lean ethics platform as a breakthrough in accountability automation. I almost laughed when I read that accountability and automation are natural enemies. A glossy trade magazine soon followed, featuring a full-page photo of her posing in the main atrium, arms folded, chin lifted, the company logo gleaming behind her like a halo. "Compliance should be effortless," the caption read. The board adored her. Investors adored her even more. Every press release had her fingerprints, smooth sentences, polished of substance. She spoke at conferences about reducing friction between oversight and output. Her voice, confident and warm, masked the fact that she didn't understand the very mechanisms she'd dismantled. The executives called her the face of modernization. The staff called her Queen Erin. I called her inevitable. I kept track of her victories from afar, sipping coffee while her name flooded LinkedIn with applause. It fascinated me, this cycle of self-congratulation. She genuinely believed she had conquered complexity, that by erasing the messy fingerprints of human verification, She'd achieved purity. That illusion was her oxygen. What none of them realized was how thin that air was. The lean ethics platform was expanding globally now, rolled out to the European division, the Canadian supplier chain, even the South American trial hub. Every expansion required a compliance confirmation, every confirmation required a valid signature, and every valid signature still pointed back to me. But I didn't interfere. I let the applause echo, let the accolades multiply, let them mistake silence for surrender. Aaron even posted a company-wide message thanking our legacy staff for paving the way to progress. My name wasn't mentioned, but my shadow lingered in the phrasing. I could picture her typing it with smug satisfaction, believing she'd rewritten history. In truth, she'd just footnoted her own undoing. Pride looks a lot like momentum right before it hits the wall. She thought the absence of resistance meant she had won. What she didn't understand, and what the press would soon discover, is that victory built on a mission has an expiration date. The countdown had already begun, and the timer was set by the same hands she tried to erase. It began on a Tuesday morning, 8:47 a.m., quiet enough to be forgettable. A logistics coordinator in the supply chain team noticed that the export validation form for a batch of clinical trial compounds wouldn't process. The screen displayed an unfamiliar message. Signatory authentication failed. Authorization revoked. She thought it was a glitch, refreshed twice, and moved on. By noon, 2 more shipments were stuck in queue. At 1:00 p.m., the manufacturing plant in Ohio halted its production run because the system couldn't generate shipping labels without the compliance confirmation token. Aaron dismissed the issue in the operations meeting. "Minor data migration delay," she said with a smile. "It's already on it." It wasn't on it. They couldn't be, because the problem didn't exist in their world of code and dashboards. The error originated where automation met law, Clause 9.4b's blind spot. The lean ethics platform couldn't verify a certification that didn't exist anymore. My name had been deleted, but the registry still recognized it as the only valid authority. Without that name, every digital signature became a ghost, visible, but hollow. Aaron's assistant drafted a memo assuring staff the issue was temporary. The tone was almost cheerful. I read the memo that evening on the company's public compliance portal, where it had been accidentally posted with open access. Old habits die hard. I still monitored their filings. The phrasing made me laugh quietly. System latency due to legacy credential misalignment. A perfect euphemism for self-inflicted blindness. By the next morning, the delay had spread to international partners. The Canadian division reported their export forms pending review. The European site flagged irregular certification data. Aaron scheduled an emergency call, her tone clipped, practiced. "We'll have this resolved within 24 hours, she promised investors. I could imagine her poised at the conference table, lipstick immaculate, voice steady while a tremor built beneath her words. She didn't understand yet that the system wasn't broken. It was obeying. It was doing exactly what it had been designed to do, stop operations when integrity couldn't be proven. That was the beauty of regulation. You can't negotiate with it. It's mathematics, wrapped in ethics. Watching the first crack appear wasn't satisfying. It was quiet, almost tragic. The machine she'd built to erase me had begun to erase itself, line by line, transaction by transaction. Somewhere inside that silence, my claws had awakened, not as revenge, but as recursion, the law correcting its own violation. Aaron thought she'd buried my legacy. She had, in fact, just signed its exhumation notice. The next 48 hours were the kind of storm that doesn't announce itself. It just starts swallowing things whole. By dawn on Thursday, the company's intranet was flooded with error tickets. each one echoing the same root failure. Certification token missing. At first, people joked about it in the Slack channels, trading memes of spinning loading icons and error cats. By mid-morning, no one was laughing. The export portal for clinical shipments refused to issue clearance codes. Vendors couldn't generate invoices because the validation field kept looping back to awaiting authorization. Aaron ordered the engineering team to bypass the approval node manually. They tried, but the API refused any override, spitting back the same line of text. No verified signatory found in registry. It was a phrase that belonged in a courtroom, not a log file. At 10:12 a.m., the first external notice arrived. From the FDA itself, the email subject line read, "License status, pending clarification." The body of the message was clinical and merciless. All production and distribution were to be suspended until proof of authorized compliance revalidation was provided. The system had officially gone from inconvenience to lockdown. The company's stock began to dip before lunch. I watched the updates roll through a public financial feed on my laptop, each percentage drop a metronome counting down to recognition. At 1:10 p.m., Aaron convened a crisis call with the executive team. The transcript leaked later, but I didn't need to see it. I could imagine her voice tightening, her script unraveling. "It's temporary," she would insist. "Just a registry delay. We'll contact the agency directly." But you can't call a system and talk your way through a regulation. The FDA's database isn't human. It doesn't care about titles, tone, or confidence. It cares about compliance. By late afternoon, suppliers were freezing contracts, their legal departments refusing to ship without confirmation of active certification. Even the courier companies backed out. One by one, the arteries of the organization constricted. And through it all, Erin refused to accept that the root cause was her own negligence. "This must be a legacy dependency," she said in a recorded town hall. "We'll isolate it and rebuild." She didn't realize she was describing her own fate. At 6:30 p.m., the first internal escalation memo circulated. Potential breach of Clause 9.4b, pending executive review. Someone in legal had finally found it. I could picture the moment perfectly. The lawyer scrolling through the compliance archive, pausing at the paragraph that had sat dormant for years. The realization would have been instant. Removing the certified signatory without transfer automatically suspended operational authority. There was no workaround, no appeal. It wasn't sabotage. It was statute. By 8 p.m., investors began calling for an emergency board meeting. The CFO, desperate to calm the market, released a statement about temporary system maintenance. The lie lasted all of 20 minutes before an analyst on social media noticed the FDA's official suspension notice. Screenshots spread like wildfire. The company's name began trending beside the words "regulatory failure." I sat at my kitchen table, the glow from my laptop casting faint shadows across my mug. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious, the hum of traffic like background applause to a performance no one else knew I'd choreographed. But this wasn't about revenge anymore. Watching it unfold felt like watching gravity do its work, a slow, inevitable return to equilibrium. Every skipped step, every dismissed warning, every deleted protocol was finally being tallied. Erin had wanted speed. She got acceleration. And in compliance, acceleration without restraint is collapse. By midnight, an internal message leaked from the European division. Operations fully suspended, awaiting reinstatement of original signatory. The irony was almost mathematical. The system was asking for me by name, a ghost in a registry demanding recognition. Erin's empire hadn't fallen because I pushed it. It fell because she'd built it on a clause that required truth. And truth, once written, doesn't expire. By Friday morning, the company resembled a patient in cardiac arrest, systems blinking, executives scrambling, every department gasping for oxygen that no longer existed. The board convened an emergency session at 9 a.m., cameras on, expressions tight. Erin entered the meeting in her trademark red blazer, trying to look composed, but even her voice had lost its voltage. "We're facing a temporary credentialing issue," she began, projecting confidence that rang hollow. "Our automation framework is sound. The system just needs manual synchronization." Across the long oak table, the general counsel cut her off. "Manual synchronization isn't permitted under federal code," he said flatly. "Clause 9.4b requires a live certification renewal by the last registered signatory. Who authorized its removal?" Erin blinked, eyes darting toward legal as if waiting for rescue. "We updated the roles to align with the new framework," she stammered. "The previous auditor had retired." "Incorrect," the counsel replied, sliding a printed page across the table. My name was highlighted in yellow beside the words "Active Certification, valid through Q2." A silence rippled across the room like an electrical field. "So, unless Ms. Sloan has been deceased in the last 72 hours, he continued, "we're operating without authority." The CFO leaned forward, voice clipped. "What exactly does that mean for production?" "It means," the counsel said, "we're in violation of federal manufacturing law. Every product we've shipped under the new platform could be recalled." The word recall detonated the last illusion of control. Erin's assistant whispered something about reaching me for a signature, but the counsel shut that down immediately. "That would constitute retroactive authorization," he said, "which is fraud." The call fractured into noise, executives arguing, the board chair trying to restore order. Erin's face, pale but defiant. "This is a clerical misunderstanding," she insisted. "I'll personally handle communication with the agency." "No," the chair said coldly. "You'll sit down and explain how a multi-million-dollar compliance platform launched without verifying its own legal backbone." Outside the meeting, the news had already leaked. An industry watchdog site posted screenshots of the suspension notice. The headline read, "NexusPharma's automation breakthrough halts after compliance scandal." Investors started bailing before the meeting even ended. Internally, panic turned to blame. Teams accused each other of mismanagement. Someone in IT tried to restore an older version of the database, but it only confirmed the problem. My credentials were hard-coded into the architecture. There was no replacing me without rewriting the system entirely, and the FDA doesn't grant rewrites. Erin tried to project authority one last time, telling her subordinates to trust the process. But there was no process left to trust, only paperwork that now pointed back to a single name she'd spent months erasing. Meanwhile, the regulators demanded immediate submission of documentation, verifying compliance continuity. The board realized they didn't have a single certified person to respond. The entire infrastructure of their ethical authority collapsed in a matter of hours. Erin's silence on that call became its own confession. Every eye in the room turned toward her. "You said the human element was obsolete," the chairman murmured, voice heavy with restrained fury. "Now we're discovering the human element was the only thing holding us together." By the end of that day, every plant was shut down, production halted, contracts suspended. The lean ethics platform, once paraded as innovation, had become a legal void. Erin Voss's name, once a headline, was now a liability. The system she built for speed had become a monument to negligence, and my claws had simply switched off the lights. The call came that evening while I was rinsing out a mug, the sound of water masking the vibration of my phone. Unknown number, familiar area code. I let it ring twice before answering. Erin's voice spilled through the line, brittle, over-rehearsed at first, then cracking around the edges. Rachel, it's Aaron, Look, we've hit a procedural snag. The FDA is freezing all activity until we get your signature revalidated. It's a technicality, really. We just need your cooperation to get things back on track. Her words tumbled out like coins, shiny and worthless. I leaned against the counter, watching the city lights fracture across my window. A technicality, I repeated softly. That's an interesting way to describe federal law. She hesitated, then tried a different tone, friendly, desperate. Please, Rachel, I know we had differences, but this affects everyone. People's jobs, research timelines, patients. I'm asking you, woman to woman, just sign the renewal. The irony almost made me smile. Woman to woman. As though shared gender could rewrite the ethics she'd ignored. You want me to validate a framework that stripped accountability from compliance? I asked. To pretend your system didn't erase the very structure designed to prevent this? It was an oversight, she said quickly. I didn't realize your authorization was tied to the foundation you dismantled, I finished. Silence pressed between us, heavy as static. I could hear papers rustling on her end, muffled. Voices in the background, the sharp exhale of panic she was trying to suppress. Rachel, she said finally, lower now, pleading. I'll make it worth your while. The board approved a consulting fee, 6 figures. You'd have full control to help us fix it. No press, no conflict. Just help me. I let that sit for a moment. The offer floating like a lure in still water. You're asking me to falsify a clean audit to patch a system that broke because it was dishonest, I said. Do you hear yourself? It's not dishonesty. It's survival. No, I corrected gently. It's consequence. She inhaled sharply, then whispered, What do you want from me? I turned off the tap, letting silence stretch just long enough for her to feel it. Do you know which clause you ignored? I asked. She didn't answer. I could imagine her scanning through documents, flipping pages she'd never really read. Clause 9-something, she guessed. Close enough, I said. It's the one that defines accountability, the one that doesn't need my permission to exist. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, a siren wailed somewhere in the distance, short, fading. Aaron's voice broke into a whisper. We can still fix this, right? I almost pitied her. Some things aren't meant to be fixed, I said. They're meant to remind. Then I hung up, leaving her in the quiet she'd spent months insisting didn't matter. By Monday morning, the collapse was public record. The financial press called it the fastest compliance implosion in corporate history. The stock dropped 17% before the opening bell and another 9% by noon. The board convened without Aaron this time. Her access badge had already been deactivated. The internal memo announcing her administrative leave pending investigation was clinical, devoid of emotion. No one mentioned her speeches, her awards, her photo on the magazine cover. Her name had become a trigger word, a digital scar erased from the company intranet overnight. In the same hour, federal inspectors arrived unannounced, badges gleaming under fluorescent lights, demanding complete documentation of the Lean Ethics Platform's authorization process. The project team froze. There was no documentation, only Aaron's PowerPoints and the hollow dashboards she'd used for her presentations. One by one, the executives began pointing fingers. The CFO blamed it. It blamed legal. Legal blamed miscommunication. But the logs told the truth. There was no certified signatory at the time of automation launch. The agency officers didn't shout, they didn't need to. They took notes, issued citations, and left in silence, the kind that lingers long after footsteps fade. I watched the reports roll in from my apartment, muted television flickering blue across my living room walls. A news anchor's voice summarized the aftermath. Sources confirmed the suspension could last months, costing the company millions. Erin appeared once, briefly, leaving the headquarters through a side door. The cameras caught her face, tired, unpainted, the confident posture gone. She ignored the shouted questions, slid into a waiting car, and disappeared. Later that day, an internal email leaked. It was from Erin to the board, time-stamped 1 hour before her dismissal. "I accept responsibility for the oversight," it read, "but I was not informed of Clause 94B's operational authority." That sentence was her final defense, and her confession. The company responded with a press release blaming legacy documentation errors. The irony was almost poetic. They were still trying to edit reality with language. But words couldn't repair what structure had already undone. By evening, the story had reached national outlets. Headlines framed her as a cautionary tale. Director of Ethics triggers company's ethical collapse. In boardrooms across the industry, executives were suddenly rediscovering the value of auditors, compliance officers, and human signatures. Erin had become both martyr and warning, proof that shortcuts in accountability always take the longest route to ruin. I didn't celebrate. I didn't need to. Watching her empire fall wasn't vengeance. It was verification. The system had simply enforced the truth she refused to read. The following week, the silence inside NexusPharma's headquarters was almost musical. The company that once bragged about real-time transparency now functioned entirely in whispers. Hallway lights stayed dim to save electricity. Departments rotated furloughs to preserve cash flow. You could feel the shame vibrating through every press statement they issued. The official narrative shifted daily. First, it was temporary maintenance, then licensing realignment, and finally, unexpected procedural lapse. Everyone knew it meant the same thing: collapse dressed as caution. Suppliers demanded penalties, investors filed motions, and a class action suit began forming before the legal department could catch its breath. Within 10 days, every production facility in North America had gone dark. Analysts estimated losses at $37 million a week. The board scrambled to hire crisis consultants, but none would touch the case without a guarantee of indemnity. Their operations weren't just frozen, they were radioactive. And through it all, my name lingered like a watermark across their paperwork, the ghost signature every auditor now looked for. The compliance team tried to reinstate new credentials, but the clause prevented retroactive substitution. Clause 9.4b didn't care about politics or perception. It only obeyed law. Every missing verification, every unacknowledged risk, every arrogant shortcut converged into one immutable truth. They had fired the very person whose absence proved the system worked. Regulators eventually released an interim report stating no evidence of malicious interference was found. Suspension resulted from procedural neglect. That sentence was my entire vindication. 5 words that reversed years of dismissal. No evidence of malicious interference. It confirmed what I'd always known. You don't need sabotage when you have structure. On the news, former employees spoke carefully, always off the record. They blamed leadership, automation, culture, anything but themselves. Erin's name disappeared entirely, replaced by job postings labeled Director of Ethical Recovery. I closed my laptop after reading that one. Recovery sounded too optimistic. The company wasn't recovering, it was remembering. Remembering that ethics isn't an accessory, it's architecture. The night after the report, I stood on my balcony. The city stretched out beneath me, cold, and bright. Somewhere in those towers, someone was writing another memo, trying to make sense of what had happened. But there was nothing mysterious about it. Systems only appear stable when the people beneath them hold their weight. Remove the wrong person and you don't just lose balance, you lose gravity. A month after the collapse, the email arrived. It came not from Erin, of course. She'd gone silent, but from a board liaison named Patricia Wong. The subject line was polite, almost pleading. Consulting opportunity, confidential. The message was short. We value your historical insight. Would you consider assisting us in reestablishing certification protocols? Compensation is flexible. I read it twice, then closed my laptop and sat back. The irony was perfect. The same board that had approved my role redundancy now wanted my help resurrecting the skeleton they'd buried. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I poured coffee, opened the blinds, and let the morning sunlight touch the stack of papers on my table. They weren't vengeance files. They were records, the proof of structure, cause, and consequence. I had kept every audit trail, every revision log, every compliance amendment from the last decade. They told the story of a company that had confused momentum for progress. It was all there, bound in quiet precision, and I realized I no longer needed to defend it. The evidence had already spoken louder than I ever could. 2 days later, I sent my answer. Thank you for the offer. I appreciate the acknowledgement. Unfortunately, my schedule doesn't permit involvement at this time. I signed it, simply Rachel Sloan. No titles, no credentials, just the name they'd once tried to erase. I hit send and felt something uncoil in my chest that had been wound tight for years. For the first time, I wasn't working to maintain balance or prevent collapse. I was simply choosing where my energy would go next. I rented a small workspace on the edge of Cambridge, an old brick building with windows that overlooked the river. No corporate logo, no mission, statement, just quiet. Within weeks, I began consulting independently for startups terrified of repeating NexusPharma's mistake. I specialized in one service, post-ethics recovery. They came in arrogant and left humbled. I didn't lecture, I audited. I showed them where integrity lived, in the footnotes, in the approval trails, in the decisions that don't trend on LinkedIn. Word spread quickly. The same investors who'd once praised Erin's speed now sought my caution. They didn't call it revenge. They called it risk management. But I knew better. Revenge had nothing to do with it. This was equilibrium. One afternoon, I received a call from a small biotech founder. He said, "We don't want to end up like Nexus. Can you help us design something unbreakable?" I told him the truth. Nothing's unbreakable, but it can be honest. That became the motto printed on the first document I ever filed under my new company's name, Sloan Integrity Systems. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. My first client signed within a week. When I sent the contract, I added one final clause at the end of the terms, written in plain, simple language. If this agreement is ever terminated, all ethical authority shall revert to the last living signatory. Not as a threat, but as a principle, because I had learned that protection and revenge are often the same motion, one meant to restore balance. As I filed the signed contract, I felt no anger, no satisfaction, just a stillness that felt like truth. I wasn't trying to rebuild what I'd lost. I was building what they never understood. A structure that didn't need applause to stand. Sometimes late at night, I still think about that conference room, the shine of the table, the hum of the projector, the way Erin's pen clicked like a countdown. It's strange how a single sound can stay with you longer than a decade of work. I never hated her, not really. Hate takes energy, and she'd already taken enough. What lingered wasn't anger, but understanding. People like Erin don't wake up planning destruction. They just confuse visibility for worth. They think ethics is an accessory, something you can polish and display until it shines bright enough to distract from the cracks. But ethics isn't decoration. It's weight-bearing architecture, the kind you never notice until it's gone. The world eventually moved on from NexusPharma. Another company filled its space, another director promised innovation, with the same bright words. The press stopped mentioning the collapse after the next scandal came along. I never corrected them, never claimed credit or whispered my part of the story. Some structures don't need names to prove their purpose. A few months ago, I found that yellow sticky note I'd left in my old binder, the one that read, "Every structure needs a keystone." I smiled when I saw it, folded it once, and placed it inside my desk drawer. It no longer felt like a warning. It felt like a memory of alignment, proof that even in silence, I had remained true to what mattered. My work now is quieter, smaller, cleaner. No press releases, no applause. Just systems that hold when they're tested, and people who read the clauses before they sign them. Sometimes I look out over the river from my office window and think about balance, not as vengeance, but as gravity restored. They thought ethics was paperwork. It was architecture all along, and I was never erased. I was the blueprint. When you work in compliance long enough, you start to see that systems don't fail suddenly. They rot slowly, under the weight of arrogance disguised as efficiency. My story wasn't about revenge. It was about exposure. How a corporation that bragged about ethics automation forgot that ethics is human. I learned that silence isn't weakness. It's often the final warning a system gets before collapse. This is the systemic flaw no one wants to talk about. The way modern workplaces reward performance theater over substance. People like Aaron get promoted not for solving problems, but for pretending the problems are gone. The real professionals, the auditors, the analysts, the quiet experts who hold the infrastructure together, become invisible until the floor gives way. What happened at NexusPharma wasn't sabotage. It was accountability catching up. Every company has its Clause 9.4b moment, the rule they think they can bend until it snaps. My only advantage was that I documented everything, not to weaponize it, but to survive it. That's the first lesson. Documentation isn't protection, it's prophecy. When the truth finally surfaces, your records are the only witnesses that can't be silenced. The second, never trade accuracy for approval. In a culture obsessed with speed, slowing down becomes rebellion. And third, arrogance always leaves a paper trail. Sometimes all you need to do is let it right itself. My downfall taught me that competence without recognition still has value. Because when the system breaks, the unrecognized become indispensable. I didn't burn the house down. I just stopped holding the roof. How to get started today. Keep personal copies of every major document you create, digital or paper. Learn the exact clauses, laws, or rules that govern your role. They are your armor. When pressured to speed things up, ask one question. Who signs the liability? Practice the art of calm refusal. It's more powerful than confrontation. The next time someone tells you your standards are old-fashioned, remember this. Innovation without integrity is just acceleration toward disaster. Now I'm curious, have you ever watched a system break because someone ignored the boring details? Tell me in the comments. Those quiet cracks are where every real story begins.